The atmosphere inside the shuttle was tense. Captain Jack Hawk, the only human among a crew of seasoned veterans, sat quietly in his seat, gazing out through the viewports at the planet below. It was a Class 13 Deathworld, a place where even the toughest alien species would struggle to survive. No one in the galaxy, not even the Federation's best warriors, had ever managed to stay alive on such a planet for long. Most who had tried had perished within hours, but Jack was different. He was Earthborn. He'd grown up on a planet where survival was an everyday battle. Earth had been a death world long before it was discovered by the rest of the galaxy, and Jack had learned early how to push through the impossible. His body was strong, his mind sharper than most. It wasn't just survival that kept him alive. It was the refusal to lose. And now, here he was, heading to a planet that was supposed to be the final test for any warrior, alien or human. The shuttle lurched as it broke through the atmosphere, the planet's surface coming into view. Jagged mountains rose like the teeth of some ancient beast, and vast, dark forests stretched for miles, hiding who knew what dangers beneath their thick canopy. The air itself seemed to pulse with life, dangerous life. It was the kind of place where every step could be your last. "Are you sure about this, Hawk?" One of the crew members, an alien warrior with green scales and glowing eyes, asked from across the room. His name was Rallick, and his kind were known across the galaxy for their unmatched strength and endurance. Yet even Rallick was nervous about what awaited them on the surface. Jack's lips curled into a smile, though there was no humor in it. "You've got your doubts, Rallick, but if we survive this, there won't be a warrior alive who doesn't fear humans." Rallick snorted but didn't argue further. He understood. The Federation had created a challenge on Class 13 to prove the strength of their warriors. Anyone who could survive the planet's dangers was seen as a legend. But Jack wasn't here to be a legend. He was here to show the galaxy something they didn't understand. The shuttle shuddered as it landed. The ground was rocky and uneven, and the air outside smelled strange, thick, and humid, carrying the faint scent of something metallic, like the Earth itself had been alive for centuries. "Stay close and stay alert," Jack said, as he unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up, grabbing his pack. The others followed suit, each of them securing weapons, armor, and supplies. Jack had nothing but a simple combat knife, a few rations, and the skills he'd learned over his lifetime on Earth. They stepped onto the surface, the ground soft beneath their boots. Jack took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the air. It wasn't like the atmosphere of Earth, but he could breathe. That was something. As they made their way across the rough terrain, they encountered their first obstacle. Massive, crawling creatures the size of small buildings. Their limbs were covered in thick armor, and their many eyes blinked in the dim light. The creatures didn't seem to notice them at first, but Jack could feel the tension building in the air. The creatures were territorial, and they were unpredictable. Rallick moved forward, ready to charge, but Jack stopped him with a hand. "Wait," he whispered. His eyes scanned the creatures. They were big, but not fast. Their armored exteriors were a weakness. Jack's mind raced, calculating every angle. He had only one shot at this. He needed to be precise. Without warning, Jack lunged forward, his combat knife flashing as he aimed for the joint of the creature's armored leg. The knife sunk in deep, and the creature let out a loud screech of pain, lashing out with its massive claws. Rallick and the others moved quickly, striking at the creature's exposed weak points. But Jack's focus was on the next one, another one of the massive beasts that had begun to stir. It was now or never. He dodged to the side, narrowly avoiding the creature's swiping claw, and aimed for its head. His knife found its mark, piercing the soft underbelly of the creature. It fell with a heavy thud, its giant body crumpling to the ground. "Nice work, human," Rallick said, a glimmer of respect in his voice. "But you're still not out of the woods. We've only just begun." Jack didn't reply, his mind already calculating their next steps. The Federation had set this up to be impossible. They knew that no one could survive the planet's dangers, but they didn't know what humans were capable of. They had never fought on Earth. They hadn't seen what a Deathworld could truly do to someone who had been born on one. The group moved on, the environment growing increasingly hostile. Giant trees reached high into the sky, their roots breaking through the ground like veins in a giant's body. Strange, glowing plants dotted the landscape, giving off an eerie light. Jack kept his eyes peeled, scanning for any signs of movement. He knew that danger could be anywhere. Hours passed, and the group found themselves at the base of a massive cliff. Above them, the wind howled, and the sky had begun to darken. The temperature dropped, and Jack felt a chill run down his spine. This was the point where most explorers turned back. The storms on this world were unpredictable. One moment, the sky could be clear, and the next, it would turn into a violent, howling mess. Rallick glanced up at the sky. "We need to move fast. The storm's coming." Jack nodded. He had been waiting for it. The storm was part of the test, part of what made this world so deadly. The creatures here didn't just survive. They thrived in the chaos. But Jack wasn't afraid. He had lived through worse. On Earth, survival wasn't a choice. It was a way of life. As the storm clouds began to gather, the winds kicked up, tearing through the trees like a giant hand. Rain started to fall in sheets, pounding the ground like bullets. The group had no choice but to push forward, deeper into the wilds of the planet. The storm was unlike anything Jack had faced before. The wind howled, pushing them off course. The rain was like ice, biting into their skin. Visibility dropped to nearly nothing. They stumbled forward, barely able to keep their footing as the ground became slick with mud. Every step felt like a struggle. Through the chaos, Jack felt something stir deep inside him. This was his element. This was what he was made for. The other warriors were faltering, struggling to keep up, but Jack never slowed. He pushed through the storm, his eyes sharp, his body moving like a machine. The others were starting to fall behind. Rallick's massive frame was weighed down by the storm, his claws slipping in the mud. One by one, the aliens in the group began to lose their footing, struggling to move through the treacherous conditions. Jack, on the other hand, was like a shadow, moving with purpose, cutting through the wind like it was nothing. He glanced back only once to see how far behind the others had fallen. They weren't far behind, but in this kind of storm, distance meant everything. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the storm stopped. The sudden silence was deafening. The clouds parted, revealing the stars above. The planet's moons cast an eerie glow on the landscape. But there was something wrong. Something unnatural. Jack felt it, too, a strange pressure in the air. His instincts screamed at him. He wasn't alone. The storm had been a warning. And whatever was out there, lurking in the dark, was coming for them. The storm had passed, but the silence that followed was unnerving. The air hung heavy, thick with tension. Jack stood still, his body alert, every sense on high alert. His hand instinctively reached for his combat knife, but he didn't draw it just yet. Something was off, something deeper than the usual dangers of the planet. The land itself felt alive, almost as if it were watching them. "Something's out there," Jack muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible over the eerie quiet that surrounded them. Rallick, who had been struggling to keep up during the storm, now stood beside him, his large, muscular form silhouetted by the pale light of the moon. He narrowed his glowing eyes, scanning the darkness. "You're right," Rallick said, his voice low and cautious. "The planet's not done with us yet." The others had finally caught up, their movements slow and labored after the brutal storm. They were exhausted, soggy, tired, and badly shaken by the violent winds. The Federation's top warriors, each from a different species, had never faced a world quite like this. But they were beginning to realize something. This was more than just a test of survival. It was a test of their very limits. "We should keep moving," Jack said, breaking the silence. "The longer we stand here, the easier it is for whatever's out there to pick us off." Reluctantly, the group nodded in agreement, their weapons drawn, eyes flicking around nervously. They moved forward, but this time their steps were more deliberate, careful. They had learned from the storm that rushing wasn't an option. Every move needed to be measured, planned. A single mistake could cost them their lives on this planet. They ventured deeper into the woods, the towering trees looming over them like silent sentinels. The thick, dark canopy overhead blocked out most of the moonlight, making the terrain even harder to navigate. But Jack's eyes adjusted quickly. He had learned to adapt to low-light conditions long ago. Back on Earth, the others weren't so lucky. Relic was a large creature, his strength unmatched by most, but his heavy feet were making more noise than he realized. It wasn't just the weight of his body. It was his armor, the clinking and clanking of his gear as he moved. Jack glanced back at him and saw the alien struggling to remain quiet. "Relic, keep it down," Jack hissed, motioning for him to lower his steps. The alien warrior growled in frustration, but nodded. He had underestimated how important silence was in a world where every living thing could be deadly. Jack led them forward, trusting his instincts. He had studied this planet's history, its dangers, its creatures. But even with all that knowledge, nothing could prepare him for what was coming. The first sign was a slight movement in the underbrush. Jack's eyes snapped to it immediately, but before he could react, there was a sudden rustling sound from behind them. He whirled around just in time to see something massive crashing through the trees. A hulking creature, covered in thick, scale-like armor, its 6 legs stomping through the ground with terrifying force. Jack's heart raced, but he didn't hesitate. "Get ready," he shouted, signaling the others to spread out. The creature let out a low, guttural growl, its massive jaws snapping open as it charged toward them. Its eyes gleamed red in the dark, and its claws were sharp enough to tear through steel. This was no ordinary predator. It was a Class 13 apex creature, a hunter built for destruction. Relic was the first to react, charging forward with a roar. His massive claws slashed through the air, but the creature was too quick. It dodged and swiped at Relic, knocking him back with a brutal force. The alien warrior crashed into a tree, the impact leaving a dent in the bark. "Focus," Jack barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Strike its weak points." The others quickly scrambled, trying to flank the beast. But it was fast, more agile than anything they'd encountered. It darted left and right, its movements calculated and precise. Jack knew they wouldn't stand a chance unless they worked together. The creature was too strong, too unpredictable. "Move, move," Jack shouted as he sprinted forward, using the terrain to his advantage. He ducked low to avoid a swipe from the creature's massive claws, then vaulted over a fallen log, positioning himself behind the beast. His combat knife gleamed in the moonlight as he prepared for his strike. With a roar, the creature turned, its massive head snapping around to face Jack. The beast's jaws parted, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth. Jack didn't flinch. Instead, he used the creature's momentary distraction to his advantage, leaping onto its back. The alien warriors, seeing Jack's move, followed suit. They attacked in unison, their strikes focused on the creature's exposed underbelly. But it was Jack who made the final blow. With a swift motion, he drove his knife deep into the soft spot behind the creature's armored neck, plunging it into the spine. The creature let out a deafening scream before collapsing to the ground, its body twitching violently as life left it. Jack stood over it, breathing heavily, his eyes scanning the area for any more threats. The others were already circling the fallen creature, each of them catching their breath and nursing their wounds. "We did it," Relic said, his voice heavy with disbelief. "I thought we were finished." Jack wiped the sweat from his brow, his expression grim. "Don't get cocky. This planet's full of surprises." The group stood in silence for a moment, taking in what had just happened. They had survived their first real test on this Deathworld. But Jack knew that this was only the beginning. They still had miles to go, and the worst was yet to come. As they moved forward, Jack's mind raced with possibilities. He could feel it. This world was testing them, yes, but it was also watching. And Jack wasn't sure if it was a warning or a promise, but something told him that the planet itself had just begun to show them its true nature. The challenges here weren't just about survival. This world wanted them to understand something deeper, to prove that they had what it took to survive in the most hostile of environments. And as the group trekked through the dense woods, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something else was waiting for them. Something far more dangerous than any beast or storm. They had survived the first trial. But what if the planet's true challenge had yet to reveal itself? The group moved in a tense silence, the air heavy with the aftereffects of their last battle. Jack kept his eyes sharp, scanning the darkened landscape around them. Despite the adrenaline still pumping through his veins, his mind was focused, calculating, analyzing. He knew better than to assume they were safe, not on a death world like this. Survival here wasn't just a matter of physical strength. It was about adaptability, quick thinking, and anticipating the unpredictable. And Jack had learned, long ago, that in a world like this, rest was a luxury that only the weak could afford. "Stay tight," Jack muttered, his voice low and steady. He wasn't speaking to anyone in particular. It was more of a reminder to himself than anyone else. Every step felt like a risk, each one laced with the possibility of something worse waiting just beyond the next rock or tree. The terrain had shifted. The forest had given way to a jagged landscape of sharp rocks and narrow canyons. The moons above were now obscured by thick, dark clouds, and the air had grown colder. Jack pulled his jacket tighter around his body, though it offered little protection against the biting chill. The winds had started to pick up again, howling through the canyon, carrying with them the scent of something that made Jack's skin crawl. "Do you smell that?" Raylick asked, his voice strained with tension. Jack paused, inhaling deeply. At first, there was nothing. Then he caught it, faint but unmistakable. The distinct, sharp scent of blood. Fresh blood. "Something's nearby," Jack said quietly, his hand going to his knife. "Be ready." The group slowed their pace, moving with more caution now. The path had narrowed, and they were forced to move single file through the narrow passage, the sharp rocks scraping against their armor as they went. The wind screamed around them, whipping their clothes and pushing them off balance, but Jack refused to be distracted. His mind remained focused on the task at hand. The others were beginning to feel it too. The unease was creeping into their movements. They weren't the only predators here. There was something else, something hunting them. Without warning, a shrill, eerie scream pierced the air. It echoed through the canyon, a sound so sharp it made the hairs on the back of Jack's neck stand on end. The sound wasn't from any creature they had seen before. This wasn't the growl of the armored beast or the low bellow of a natural predator. No, this was different. This was something intelligent, something deliberate. "Move," Jack barked, his instincts kicking in. He didn't wait for the others. He bolted forward, his boots scraping against the rough ground as he sprinted through the narrow canyon. The others followed, their breaths heavy, but Jack didn't look back. Not yet. As he ran, Jack's mind raced. The scream had come from ahead, just beyond the next turn in the canyon. Whatever had made it was powerful, too powerful to be ignored. He couldn't let the others fall behind. This was no longer just about surviving the environment. They were up against something that had a mind of its own. A shape loomed ahead in the darkness, something huge and vaguely humanoid. Jack's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't a creature. This was something else entirely. "Get down," he shouted as he skidded to a halt, diving into the shadows as the others followed suit. The figure ahead moved closer, its movements slow and deliberate, like it was savoring every step. It wasn't a beast. It was tall. its silhouette impossibly thin, and the air around it seemed to warp, as if reality itself was bending to its will. The scream had stopped, but the sense of dread it left behind lingered, hanging thick in the air. It stopped in front of them, not 20 meters away, and Jack felt the weight of its gaze, even though its eyes were hidden in shadow. This wasn't just an enemy. This was a predator that knew how to stalk its prey, to make them feel hunted before the kill. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. The wind howled in the canyon, but it was as though the creature's presence had muted everything else. The rest of the group held their breath, staying hidden, but Jack could feel his pulse hammering in his ears. They couldn't stay hidden forever. "We can't outrun this thing," Rayleigh whispered, his voice strained. "What is that thing?" Jack didn't answer. His mind was already working, calculating their options. There was no room to run, no space to hide. If they wanted to survive, they needed to face whatever it was head-on. But how? The creature took another step forward, its movements almost graceful, as though it was gliding across the rocky ground. It stopped just in front of a massive rock, its head tilting slightly to the side as if it was studying them. It knew they were there. It knew they were afraid. And that was exactly what it wanted. Jack's grip tightened on his knife, but it was useless against something like this. This wasn't just a creature. This was something different, something far beyond the simple monsters they'd already faced. The sense of intelligence, of purpose, was overwhelming. Suddenly, the ground beneath them trembled. The walls of the canyon seemed to shift. Jack's eyes darted from side to side. The creature wasn't alone. From the darkness, more shapes emerged, shadows moving like liquid, bending around the edges of reality. At first, they were barely visible, just outlines in the shifting gloom. But then, as the creature in front of them stepped aside, the others became clear, more of the same, thin, humanoid figures, each one taller than the last. They moved with eerie synchronization, their limbs elongated and unnatural, their faces hidden beneath dark hoods or masks. This wasn't just one predator. It was a collective. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as the reality of their situation hit him. There was no way to fight this. They couldn't win against something like this, not unless they found a way to disrupt their pattern, to make them vulnerable. And that would take time. Time they didn't have. The group remained frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe. They could hear the whispers now, soft voices that seemed to echo in the air around them. Words they didn't understand, but that carried an undeniable sense of menace. Jack knew one thing for certain. These weren't just creatures. They weren't even predators. They were something much worse, intelligent, organized, and absolutely merciless. In that moment, Jack understood. The planet wasn't just testing them. It was a trap. And now they had stepped into it. The air grew colder as the figures surrounded them, their movements smooth and calculated, like predators circling their prey. Jack's heart raced in his chest, but he kept his breathing steady. Panic wouldn't help them now. In a world like this, you either adapted or you died. And Jack wasn't ready to die. "Stay calm," he whispered, though his voice barely broke through the oppressive silence. Rayleigh, still breathing heavily from the earlier battles, shifted uneasily. "How do we fight these things? They don't look like anything I've ever seen." "They're not from around here," Jack replied, his gaze never leaving the figures. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. They were surrounded, and every instinct he had told him they couldn't just charge in. There had to be a way to outsmart them. The creatures weren't making a move yet, but their presence felt like a force of nature, a suffocating weight pressing down on the group. Jack could feel the eyes of the tall figures studying them, calculating their next move. They didn't need to speak, but somehow Jack knew they understood exactly how to break their defenses. The canyon felt even smaller now. The shadows between the rocks grew deeper, stretching like dark hands waiting to pull them into oblivion. Jack shifted his weight, mentally preparing himself for the inevitable. It wasn't a question of if they would fight. But when? Then, unexpectedly, one of the figures spoke. Its voice was soft, almost melodic, but there was a cold, eerie quality to it that made the words feel like an accusation. "Why do you fight?" The voice was haunting, echoing in Jack's mind even as it filled the canyon. "The challenge is in understanding, not in fighting." Jack's jaw tightened. The last thing they needed was a philosophical lecture from whatever these creatures were. "What are you?" Jack demanded, his voice low but steady, refusing to show fear. "What do you want?" The creature tilted its head, its glowing eyes narrowing, as if it were amused by the question. Then it stepped forward, its long, slender limbs moving with unnerving precision. As it approached, Jack noticed something that hadn't been visible before. The creature's skin wasn't smooth, but covered in what appeared to be ancient, shifting markings, like tattoos or symbols that glowed faintly under the moonlight. "We are the observers," the figure replied, the words sending a chill through Jack's spine. "We were here long before you. We have seen countless species, countless warriors rise and fall. But you, human, are different." The word human hung in the air, thick with a strange emphasis. Jack felt the weight of the creature's gaze, almost as though it could see straight into his soul. "Different?" Jack asked, his voice steady despite the unease creeping up his spine. "In what way?" The creature remained still, studying him as if he were some curious specimen, not a foe. "You are the only species to willingly step into the unknown with no expectation of survival. You do not fear the Deathworld. You embrace it. And that is why you are dangerous." A chill ran down Jack's spine. Dangerous? They were the ones being hunted, the ones forced to fight for every step they took. But these creatures, they weren't seeing the world the same way. "We don't have a choice," Jack said, though his voice was barely a whisper. "We're fighting to survive." The creature's expression seemed to shift, though its face remained hidden in the shadow of its hood. "Survival is not the same as living." Before Jack could respond, there was a sudden movement from the others. Rallick's massive form shifted uneasily, his muscles tensing like a coiled spring. He had had enough of the cryptic answers. He stepped forward, his body towering over the alien beings. "We don't have time for your riddles," Rallick growled. "We're here to fight, and we will." The tension in the air grew thicker. The creatures didn't seem to react immediately. They just stood there, their heads slightly tilted, as though they were studying Rallick's aggressive stance with amusement. Then the first sign of hostility emerged. A sharp, high-pitched hum filled the air, followed by a sudden pulse of energy that shot from one of the figures. The energy hit the ground near Rallick's feet, sending a tremor through the earth and causing rocks to scatter in all directions. "Enough," Jack shouted, his instincts kicking in. It was clear now. They weren't going to get out of this without a fight. Rallick, sensing Jack's urgency, let out a primal roar, his claws extending as he lunged forward. The battle had begun. The creatures reacted instantly, moving with terrifying speed. They were more than just physical threats. They were capable of manipulating the environment around them. Jack barely ducked in time as one of the figures sent a shockwave through the ground, causing the rocks beneath his feet to crack and shift. It was like fighting against the planet itself. "Split up," Jack shouted, barely able to hear himself over the chaotic noise of the battle. "Don't let them trap you." The group scattered, moving quickly to avoid the psychic-like attacks from the creatures. Jack rolled to the side, narrowly avoiding another blast, his combat knife drawn and ready. He needed to get close, but it was clear now that brute force alone wouldn't win this fight. One of the creatures lunged at him from the shadows, its elongated limbs snapping forward with unnatural speed. Jack reacted in a split second, twisting to the side and driving his knife into its exposed side. The creature screeched, but instead of retreating, it wrapped its long, spindly arms around Jack, pulling him in close. He grunted, trying to break free, but the creature's grip was vice-like. In an instant, Its cold breath hit his face, and he could feel its sharpened teeth brushing against his skin. Jack was pinned, but he refused to give in. He slammed his elbow into the creature's side, forcing it to loosen its grip just enough for him to twist free. "Get off me," he shouted, slashing with his knife again. The creature recoiled, but it wasn't done. It backed away only long enough to assess its next move. Jack wasn't alone for long. Relic appeared, roaring as he charged in, his claws swiping at the creature with brutal force. It was enough to make the creature retreat for a moment, its form vanishing back into the shadows. But Jack knew it wasn't over. They had underestimated these beings. The true battle was not just physical. It was mental, psychological. These observers weren't just testing their strength. They were studying their weaknesses. And if they couldn't outsmart these creatures, if they couldn't outlast them, there was no telling how long they would survive on this world. "Regroup," Jack shouted, his voice filled with urgency. They needed to find a way to break free, to outwit the creatures before they were outmatched completely. As the team came together, Jack's thoughts raced. The planet wasn't just dangerous. It was alive, and it was watching. But now, they had one thing in their favor. They knew what they were up against. And it wasn't just a Deathworld anymore. It was a challenge of their minds as much as their bodies. The air was thick with tension, every breath a struggle as the team huddled together, regrouping. The canyon had become a labyrinth of shadows and shifting shapes, their attackers seemingly everywhere. Jack could feel his pulse thundering in his ears, but he had learned to ignore it. In this world, the only thing that mattered was survival, and right now, their survival depended on their ability to think, to adapt. They couldn't afford to make a mistake. Not now. Ralik's voice cut through the silence, low and filled with a strange, almost primal growl. "These creatures are relentless. We need a plan, and we need it fast." Jack's mind raced. The observers weren't like anything they had encountered before. These beings didn't just use brute force. They manipulated the environment, controlled their surroundings, and had an almost supernatural ability to predict their every move. It was like fighting a force of nature, an intelligence that understood the game better than they ever could. "We can't just keep running," Jack said, his voice steady but laced with urgency. "We have to turn the tables. They're expecting us to fall apart. But if we show them something they didn't anticipate, we might just get the edge." "They know us too well," Ralik muttered, glancing nervously into the darkness. "How do you plan to surprise them?" Jack glanced around at his team. They were battered, exhausted, but their resolve was still strong. Each of them had been tested to their limits already, but they had survived. Barely. And now, they had to take the fight to the observers. "We use their own tactics against them," Jack said, his eyes narrowing. "These creatures can manipulate the environment, but they don't seem to be able to predict every possible outcome. We can use the terrain against them, force them into a place where they don't have the upper hand." The others exchanged uneasy glances. It was a risky strategy, but Jack could see they were ready to give it a shot. Survival depended on pushing beyond their comfort zones, and this was their best chance. Jack turned to the others, giving them each a quick nod. "Relic, you're our front line. Draw them out. Let them think you're easy prey. Stay mobile, but keep them occupied." Relic nodded grimly, the massive warrior ready for whatever came next. "Jade, you and Zane take the high ground," Jack continued, his voice sharp with focus. "Stay out of sight, but keep your weapons ready. We need to hit them when they least expect it." The others nodded in acknowledgement. Jack's mind raced with the next part of the plan. "I'll be the distraction," Jack said, a plan beginning to take shape in his mind. "I'll lead them to the valley, then you strike." He turned his attention to the canyon ahead. The walls were steep, jagged, perfect for an ambush. If they could lure the observers into the narrowest part of the canyon, they'd have a chance to trap them. The terrain would limit the observers' ability to use their unpredictable movements, forcing them to fight on the humans' terms. It was a calculated risk, but one they had no choice but to take. The group set into motion, moving silently through the dark, their bodies tense and alert. Every step felt like a countdown, the weight of the unknown pressing on them from all sides. As Jack moved forward, he could hear the eerie hums of the observers' energy blasts in the distance. They were close, too close. He slowed his pace, leading the creatures into the valley. As expected, the figures emerged from the shadows, their movements graceful, their steps deliberate. They were watching him, waiting for him to make his move. Jack made sure they saw him. They needed to focus on him, and he needed them to underestimate him. "Here we go," Jack muttered, drawing his combat knife and preparing himself for the first strike. Without warning, Relic roared, charging toward the observers. His massive frame barreled down on the creatures, and they responded with quick, unnatural movements, dodging his strikes and retaliating with energy blasts that hit the ground, causing rocks to explode in all directions. Jack grinned. The fight had begun. "Now," he shouted, and in an instant, the rest of the team sprang into action. Jade and Zane launched themselves from the high ground, dropping behind the creatures and firing their weapons in quick, accurate bursts. The blasts were enough to momentarily disorient the observers, and Jack took advantage of the opening. He sprinted forward, dodging the energy blasts that narrowly missed him, and dove into the fray. His knife was a blur as he slashed at the nearest observer, landing a hit that didn't seem to faze it in the slightest. The creature retaliated, its long limbs snapping out to grab Jack by the throat. But Jack was quicker. He twisted, using the creature's momentum against it, and drove his knife deep into its chest. It shrieked, a high-pitched, shrill sound that echoed across the canyon. But before Jack could savor his victory, more observers appeared, converging from every direction. They were relentless, moving faster than Jack could track. "Keep pushing them back," Jack yelled, his voice raw as he fought to stay on his feet. His movements were becoming slower, his muscles aching from the continuous battle, but there was no choice but to keep fighting. The moment they stopped, they were finished. The creatures were closing in. Jack had no idea how long they could keep this up. They needed to bring this to an end, and fast. Suddenly, Jack's foot hit something solid, a boulder protruding from the canyon wall. He grabbed onto it, using it to propel himself upward, and in a burst of energy, he reached the high ground. Jade and Zane were already in position, their weapons trained on the remaining observers. "Now," Jack shouted. Together, they unleashed everything they had left. The combined firepower, the sudden shift in position, and the ambush they had set up were enough to catch the observers off guard. They stumbled back, unable to react quickly enough to the coordinated attack. It was their moment. One by one, the observers fell. Their bodies crumpled, lifeless, as the team's weapons tore through them. For a moment, there was silence, broken only by the harsh breaths of the survivors. Jack lowered his weapon, scanning the canyon. There were no more figures emerging from the shadows. The battle was over. But even as he allowed himself a brief moment of relief, Jack knew the truth. This wasn't a victory. It was only a temporary reprieve. The Deathworld was still there, still waiting, and the creatures that had hunted them were just one more test. Jack's team had survived this encounter, but the world was far from conquered. And as they moved out of the canyon, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something even worse was waiting for them ahead. As the dust settled over the battlefield, the sounds of the raging fight began to fade. The once oppressive air now felt empty, hollow, as if the entire canyon had exhaled after a long, drawn-out struggle. Jack wiped the sweat from his brow, his muscles aching from the intensity of the fight, but there was no time to rest. Relic, still breathing heavily from the fight, stood tall and scanned their surroundings. His massive figure seemed unshaken, but his eyes were alert, his posture tense. "We're not done yet," he said, his voice low and steady. Jack nodded, though exhaustion was evident on his face. "We can't relax just yet. The battle might be over, But the Deathworld doesn't give up easily. We need to keep moving. The group gathered their weapons, checking their gear, and made sure their injured were tended to. Zane's leg was bruised, and Jade had a cut on her arm, but they were alive. For now, that was enough. "We've won this fight, but we know it won't be the last," Jack said, looking to each member of his team. "We've faced something new today, something unlike anything we've encountered before." Those observers were a different breed. They can manipulate the environment, anticipate our moves. They're not just creatures. They're an intelligent, calculating force, and they won't stop hunting us. Rallick grunted, clearly eager to continue, but Jack knew he was right to be cautious. "How do we defeat them?" Jade asked, her voice tinged with both frustration and fear. "We can't just keep fighting blindly. There has to be a way to outsmart them." Jack clenched his fists, staring at the distant canyon walls. The terrain around them was just as dangerous as the creatures. The rocks, the cliffs, the shifting shadows, they all seemed alive, part of the endless challenge of the Deathworld. But Jack was determined. He had survived too much to give up now. "We need to be smarter. We need to study them. Understand how they think." "And how do we do that?" Zane asked. His voice was sharp, but there was an edge of hope in it too. "I mean, we can't keep throwing ourselves into the fire, hoping we'll come out on top." Jack exhaled slowly, considering the question. "We track them. We learn their movements, their weaknesses. They've studied us. Now, it's our turn." The group was silent for a moment, processing his words. The idea of hunting the observers was a risky one, but Jack knew they had no choice. There were only two options left: adapt or die. "All right," Jade finally said, nodding in agreement. "We track them, learn from them. But how do we avoid walking straight into another trap?" Jack's lips curled into a tight smile. "We don't. We set our own traps." The decision was made. They would become the hunters. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the rocky landscape, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. They had only just begun to scratch the surface of what the Deathworld held in store for them. The observers were just one piece of a much larger puzzle. Jack glanced toward the distant sky, watching the stars slowly emerge, twinkling with an eerie promise. They had survived this battle, but every nightfall brought new dangers. And as the team moved deeper into the Deathworld, he knew they would face even greater challenges. The Deathworld had already shown them its teeth. But now, Jack and his team would make their stand. And this time, they would strike first.